We live in an age of job anxiety. Every week, there's a new headline warning that artificial intelligence is coming for our livelihoods. Office jobs, creative work, even professions that once felt untouchable. And that fear isn't irrational. Big technological shifts have always reshaped labor markets. Some jobs disappear, new ones emerge. That's the story we've been told for decades. But while attention is focused on jobs that might vanish someday, something far more concrete is already happening. Across the developed world, countries are quietly running out of teachers and doctors. These are not speculative jobs. They don't vanish in recessions. They aren't easily automated, and societies cannot function without them. Yet schools and hospitals are struggling to stay staffed. Waiting lists are growing. Class sizes are rising. Burnout is becoming normal. According to UNESCO, maintaining today's education systems alone will require millions of new teachers by 2030. In healthcare, the situation is even more severe. The World Health Organization estimates a global shortfall of more than 11 million health workers within the same time frame. This isn't a future problem. It's already happening. And what makes this crisis different is that everyone agrees it exists. Governments acknowledge it, institutions warn about it, reports pile up year after year. Yet the shortage keeps getting worse. So we're left with three uncomfortable questions. Why are essential workers disappearing in the first place? Why can't migration keep solving this problem? And what happens if this shortage stops being temporary and becomes permanent? To answer that, we need to understand how these professions used to work and why the system that sustained them is quietly breaking down. For most of the last century, supplying teachers and doctors followed a predictable pattern. Countries trained them domestically, usually through heavily subsidized public systems. Because governments understood these roles as infrastructure, not just jobs, but foundations of a functioning society. Each year, new graduates entered classrooms and hospitals. Older workers retired gradually. As long as the numbers roughly balanced, the system held. This worked because demographics supported it. Populations were younger, birth rates were high enough to ensure a steady pipeline of future workers. And demand grew slowly enough for institutions to keep up. Training capacity didn't need to expand aggressively. Replacement was gradual, predictable. But that demographic foundation is gone. Across almost every high income country, populations are aging rapidly. At the same time, birth rates have fallen well below replacement levels. In countries like Japan, Italy, Germany, and South Korea, more than 1 in 5 people is already over 65. And older societies need more healthcare, not less. Meanwhile, fewer young people are entering the workforce, just as demand for teachers and doctors accelerates. Training new teachers takes years. Training doctors often takes a decade or more, which means the shortages we see today were locked in long ago. They're the result of decisions made 10, sometimes 20 years earlier. At first glance, teaching and medicine still look like safe careers. They offer stability, clear career paths, and wages that often rise above national averages over time. On paper, these look like rational choices. But averages hide incentives, because when you compare these professions to others that require similar levels of education, responsibility, and time investment, the picture starts to change. Public sector careers tend to cap earnings. Salary bands are fixed. Progression is slow. And performance rarely translates into significantly higher pay. In contrast, private sector alternatives reward scarcity and leverage. An engineer, consultant, or financial analyst with comparable education can scale income much faster, especially in fields where global demand exists. So, for high performing students, the opportunity cost becomes impossible to ignore. Choosing teaching or medicine doesn't just mean choosing service. It often means accepting lower lifetime earnings relative to effort. At the same time, the cost of entering these professions has risen dramatically. Training takes longer. Certification requirements expand. Student debt accumulates. In many countries, medical graduates begin their careers already burdened by six-figure debt. Teachers often face similar pressures, especially where education degrees are no longer subsidized. And crucially, these costs arrive early, while the financial payoff arrives much later. That delay matters because people make career decisions not just on lifetime earnings, but on cash flow, risk, and flexibility. Now add geography. The places where teachers and doctors are needed most are often the same places with the highest housing costs: urban centers, capital cities, high demand regions. So even when wages are above average, they fail to keep up with living costs. This gap turns stability into strain. And then there's the job itself. Over time, these professions have absorbed growing administrative burdens. Paperwork expands. Compliance increases. Metrics multiply. Time that was once spent teaching or treating patients is increasingly spent managing systems. At the same time, staff shortages feed directly into workload. Fewer teachers mean larger classes. Fewer doctors mean longer shifts. And less room to recover. Burnout stops being an exception. It becomes structural. This combination creates a feedback loop. Fewer people begin training. More leave early. Those who remain carry more pressure, which pushes even more people out. This is not a sudden collapse. It's a slow erosion. And because it happens gradually, it's easy to normalize. But over time, the system loses experience. It loses resilience. And eventually, it loses the ability to replace itself. For years, governments found a way to delay this problem. They didn't fix incentives. They didn't expand training fast enough. They didn't fundamentally redesign careers. Instead, they imported labor. Migration became the pressure valve. If a country couldn't train enough teachers or doctors at home, it recruited them from elsewhere. On paper, this looked efficient. Training professionals is expensive. It takes years. And results arrive far outside political cycles. Migration, by contrast, works immediately. A visa change can fill a hospital ward in months. So governments leaned into it. Doctors were fast-tracked. Nurses were prioritized. Teaching visas expanded. In countries like the UK, Canada, Australia, and parts of Europe, foreign trained professionals became essential to keeping systems running. At its peak, nearly one-third of doctors in the UK were trained abroad. In some hospitals, the majority of nursing staff came from overseas. For a while, it worked. Classrooms stayed open. Hospitals avoided collapse. Waiting lists grew more slowly. But this solution has a hidden flaw. Migration doesn't create workers, it redistributes them. When a rich country recruits a doctor, that doctor comes from somewhere else, often from countries with shortages of their own. Places that invested heavily in training only to lose talent before seeing the return. In Ghana, for example, the majority of doctors trained in the 1990s were working abroad just a few years after graduation. In Kenya, the emigration of a relatively small number of doctors represented tens of millions of dollars in lost training investment. The global imbalance is stark. High income countries employ the majority of the world's health workers, while carrying a fraction of the global disease burden. Low income countries face the opposite reality: more illness, fewer professionals. So migration doesn't solve the shortage, it moves it. And even for destination countries, the fix is unstable. Migrant professionals are more mobile by definition. They move for opportunity, for pay, for conditions. That means many systems become stepping stones rather than destinations. A doctor arrives, builds experience, then moves again, often to higher paying systems. The result is churn. New arrivals replace those who leave, without ever resolving the underlying shortage. From the outside, staffing levels look stable. From the inside, continuity disappears. Teams lose institutional knowledge. Mentorship weakens. And burnout spreads faster. This is why migration works best as a supplement, not as a foundation. But over time, many systems treated it as the foundation. And that choice delayed the harder decisions: raising pay, improving working conditions, expanding domestic training capacity. Migration bought time, but it also created dependence. And now, that buffer is thinning. As global shortages grow, competition for workers intensifies. More countries are recruiting from the same shrinking pool, which means migration can no longer absorb the pressure. The delay has run out. The most dangerous moment for any system is not when it breaks suddenly. It's when failure becomes routine. When shortages stop being treated as emergencies and start being treated as background noise. This is where education and healthcare are heading. At first, the signals are subtle. Class sizes creep upward. Appointment times get shorter. Waiting lists lengthen just enough to be inconvenient, but not shocking. From the outside, the system still appears to function. Schools remain open, hospitals still operate. But inside the system, something changes. Less experienced workers are asked to carry more responsibility. Senior staff spend more time covering gaps and less time mentoring. Over time, quality erodes quietly. In education, this matters more than it appears. Years of research show that learning outcomes, not just years spent in school, are what drive long term economic growth. When teacher shortages persist, schools narrow what they can realistically teach. Critical thinking gives way to rote instruction. Advanced subjects become optional. The consequences don't show up immediately, they appear years later in lower productivity, weaker innovation, and slower income growth. Healthcare moves faster. When staffing shortages become chronic, diagnoses are delayed, treatment windows are missed. Conditions that were once manageable become emergencies. In several advanced economies, excess deaths linked to delayed care are already rising. A less healthy population is a less productive one. More people leave the workforce early. More rely on disability and social support. Healthcare systems shift from prevention to crisis management. And crisis management is always more expensive. This creates a feedback loop. Shortages increase workload. Higher workload accelerates burnout. Burnout drives more exits, and the cycle tightens. At the macro level, this reshapes the economy. Growth slows, not because people stop working, but because human capital weakens. At the same time, inequality widens. Those who can afford private alternatives opt out. Private schools, private clinics, private insurance. Everyone else waits. The system doesn't collapse, it bifurcates. One track for those with resources, another for everyone else. Globally, the same dynamic plays out between countries. When rich nations pull essential workers from poorer ones, they weaken the very systems those countries need to develop, which makes future shortages even worse. This isn't a temporary imbalance, it's structural. And once a system adapts to permanent understaffing, reversing it becomes much harder because expectations adjust. Budgets normalize around scarcity, and political urgency fades. The danger isn't that societies suddenly wake up without teachers and doctors. The danger is that they slowly accept a world with fewer of them. And that acceptance quietly reshapes the future. So, where does this leave us? If shortages in education and healthcare are structural, if migration can only delay the problem, and if training pipelines move too slowly to catch up, does that mean this outcome is inevitable? Not exactly, because there are countries that manage to slow, and in some cases reverse, these dynamics. And what they did wasn't mysterious. They didn't rely on emergency fixes. They didn't treat shortages as temporary shocks. They changed incentives. In places where pay kept pace with responsibility, where workloads were capped, and where training capacity expanded before retirements peaked, retention improved. Portugal is one example. By steadily expanding medical school capacity over decades, the country reached one of the highest doctor to population ratios in Europe. This reduced reliance on foreign recruitment and stabilized primary care. Romania followed a different path. After losing large numbers of doctors in the 2000s, it raised pay, improved working conditions, and expanded training. Outflows dropped sharply. These systems didn't become perfect, but they became sustainable, which tells us something important. The problem isn't that societies can't fix these shortages. It's that fixing them requires accepting real trade-offs. Higher public spending, long-term planning beyond election cycles, and limits on how much pressure institutions can absorb. Migration remains part of the picture, but it works best as a supplement, not as the foundation. Technology can help too, not by replacing teachers and doctors, but by removing administrative burden and allowing professionals to focus on the work only humans can do. Used correctly, technology makes these jobs more sustainable. Used incorrectly, it accelerates burnout. But even with better policy, better pay, and better tools, there's a deeper question beneath all of this. What kind of system do societies actually want? One that runs as lean as possible until it breaks? Or one that builds redundancy and accepts higher costs in exchange for resilience? Because education and healthcare aren't just services, they're foundations. Once they weaken, everything built on top of them becomes fragile. The real risk isn't sudden collapse, it's slow normalization. A world where overcrowded classrooms feel ordinary, where long waits for care feel inevitable, where fewer people choose these professions because they no longer believe the system will support them. At that point, the system hasn't failed. It has adapted to scarcity. And reversing that adaptation is far harder than preventing it in the first place. So the question isn't whether societies can afford to fix these shortages. It's whether they can afford not to.